winter college weekend for Champlain College. With COVID, we have had to shake things up, just like everyone in the world has, and create new opportunities to share information between all the people within the Champlain community, but we also really want to always extend our connections to the Peterborough community. We are so grateful for you to have registered and logged in today. It's always such an important thing to get together and share stories, share content. I also would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Trent University is on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. I would like to also take a moment to thank Jeremy Ward for joining us today. Jeremy Ward is the curator of the Peterborough Canoe Museum. Throughout our presentation today, I'm hoping that Jeremy is going to explain just a little bit about why our amazing canoe museum plays such a large role, even on the national scale. Like, it is an amazing treasure that we have here in the Peterborough community. I remember always hearing about it. I've been in Peterborough for 25 years now. I came as, I don't know how old I am anymore. When was that? But I came to Peterborough as an undergrad student, fell in love with this community, and I actually had not visited the Canoe Museum until my graduate studies, which is just such a shame. Every person I told that I hadn't been just really expressed the need to do so. And so I hope that even though the Canoe Museum can't be open right now due to COVID, Jeremy triggers all of your interest in visiting it in person. It is definitely a sight to see. I am going to take a moment to introduce Jeremy. I'm reading this information just so that people know you can find this information on the Canoe Museum website. I was just recently told by Jeremy that it might be a little out of date, so maybe he can share a few more updates about some of the projects he's working on. Jeremy is the curator for the Peterborough Canoe Museum. His involvement with the museum began as a volunteer, as all great things do begin that way. He joined the staff in 1997. Previously, he coordinated a field school for Trent University in the Nunavut community of Pangnirtung. How do you say it, Jeremy?
Pangnirtung.
Thank you. And undertook cabinet making, birch bark canoe building, and archaeological work in Greece. A graduate of Trent University's Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies programs, Jeremy's work has included curating or producing more than 10 major exhibitions, many of which are still on display or traveling. He has also researched and been featured in documentaries aired on the Discovery Channel and the BBC, including most recently, The Nature of Things. A notable project was the research and construction of a 36-foot birch bark canoe. Working before the public at the museum, along with a team of volunteers, Jeremy built an authentic, functional example of the canot de maître, the workhorse vehicle of the 18th century and early 19th century fur trade in Canada. Jeremy has also acted as the director of the museum's Small Craft Association on a volunteer basis. So I'd like to take a moment to, again, thank Jeremy for coming here to speak to us today and to introduce the Canoe Museum to us. I'd like to share some information. So if anyone has questions, Jeremy, how would you like to proceed with questions today?
It might be easiest if you can to hold it till the end, just because I won't be monitoring. But Tina, if you'd like, if something comes in, or throw it up on a chat, that would be just fine too.
Right.
Actually, that would be great. If you want to, if it's immediate to what I'm talking to and you throw it up on a chat, maybe I can speak to it then and there, or we can circle back at the end.
Okay, wonderful. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them up in the chat. And Jeremy, other than that, I think we'll leave it to you.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you, Tina, and thank you for the land acknowledgement. So I'm going to share screen. Just let me know when this comes through. I'll turn off my Zoom notice here. Okay, do you see that now? Mm-hmm. Don't need to see my outlook. All right. So thank you for that. It's embarrassing to have your bio read back to you, and it certainly shows I've worked here a long time because I don't pay any attention to it, and that is badly out of date. But my relationship with Trent is deep and rich. I grew up in a Trent environment. My stepfather went to Trent during the gown days back in the 60s, in the beginnings. Stories of Tom Simons were legend then and continued to be, of course. I was a student there in the 1990s, did an honors degree in Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies. It was called Native Studies back then. Started a master's and abandoned my master's to join this project, the Canadian Canoe Museum. And I've been working with this project now for 22 years. It's been a great ride. It's been exciting. And I'm happy to say my daughter of 19 years is online at Trent this year too. So that's 3 generations in the house. And I appreciate you coming in on a Friday after long days being online in this current environment. It's great to have you here and to walk about with you. What I'd like to do today is introduce the museum maybe from a different perspective you would if you visited us after lockdown. Take you behind the scenes a little bit, explore the collection and explore the museum, what it does, what it thinks about, what it gets excited about, a bit of its network of relations that take us across the country, and look ahead to building a new museum here in Peterborough on the water. We are, of course, I think the largest watercraft museum collection in the world, and we are located in a parking lot, which makes a lot of sense. Well, it certainly has. This is a warehouse across the parking lot where we currently are. This used to make outboard motors at Outboard Marine Corporation. This is a 30,000 square foot room with 500 souls in here resting, waiting to be encountered by museum guests and researchers, families coming to reconnect with a canoe that used to be in their family. And where I will take you from this is, oh yes, right, with the Zoom presentation, I can't use the normal toggles, is to introduce maybe a different way that we look at things, certainly from here at the Canadian Canoe Museum. This is a stunning portrait of Turtle Island of Canada. I'm sorry, Alaska's chopped off and everything south of the 49th, but this is a map devoid of any geopolitical boundaries. Joy Charbonneau did this map some years ago and shows the interconnected waterways of where we are, and provides a real muse for a themed collection like this. This is both the inland coastal waterways and inland waterways and the coastal waterways that have connected people to their environment and to their neighbors and to each other for millennia. The canoe is, of course, an Indigenous invention, and it retains that enduring relationship today across Turtle Island, across Canada, and around the world, indeed. And the museum's collection can articulate that. A map like this certainly speaks to why, if you will, the canoe and the kayak or the kayak, as a response to living here, as a response to the interconnectedness of the water flowing over land. And it also, from where I sit, suggests why a country like Canada should have a place that collects, that preserves, but also cares for, more importantly, thinks about these things and allows others to share their perspectives through the museum. And that is something that we are striving to do better in every day, and hope to do more of that in the coming years. The Canoe Museum's profile began as a small little grassroots organization, and it's not quite that anymore, but it continues to retain that grassroots spirit in its heart, where it's located. And thank you for the land acknowledgement. The museum's located on traditional territories, Mississauga, under First Nations on Treaty 20 within the Williams Treaties territories. The Canoe Museum could also exist in many, many major communities and lesser communities right across this country for very good reason, for the interconnections of these waterways. Located here on the Autonomy, this is an ancient canoeing route with ancient canoe making, canoe use, and habitation by many First Nations in this route. And the canoe history here is deep and rich. If we do a deeper dive into this map, and you just get a sense of how rich these connections truly are. To understand this, you need to not see this as a flat two-dimensional image, but in fact sloped, water flowing over land, considered as watersheds. And the interconnectedness of those waterways is really where the magic happens here. What's not shown here is that human element, which is the connections that join different watersheds or that circumnavigate obstacles. Canoeists might call these portage or nastagen. And that's that sort of wonderful, almost invisible human element that's missing here. And the connecting link then is that human invention, that indigenous technology, the canoe, that still enchants and inspires us, many of us today. Well, what does this look like as a themed collection? What is the definition of a canoe? There really isn't anything that sticks and holds. At its simplest, at its most crude, it might be an object that is pointed at both ends, paddled facing forward on water. This lets us leave the shorelines of the streams and lakes and even coastlines around the world. And the canoe has been instrumental in humankind filling in the last corners of the globe. We only have to look at the incredible wayfaring technology of the Polynesians and the recent voyages by the Hokulea project out of Hawaii, where they have been reconnecting the archipelago of Polynesian territories right across the Pacific, and then just recently circumnavigated the globe in an ocean-going sailing canoe called Hokulea. But at its simplest, the canoe offers us something very, very simple as an equation, and therefore gives us a really interesting opportunity to study, well, you can't do anything to this object without it reflecting choices you've made. It's a perfect platform for tinkering. And when you walk around a room full of 500 souls like this, and you start to look closely at them, you can see the choices made, that their builders made, their users made, based on their priorities, the effects of the cultural traditions that influence their lives and are important for recognizing who they are and where they come from. Also reflect the environment that they come from, and also suggest what their priorities were and what trade-offs they're willing to make. You think about a racing canoe, well, it goes straight and it goes very fast, and it does not carry a lot, and it cannot navigate whitewater because it doesn't turn worth a damn. It certainly won't carry much of a load either, besides the athlete. Other canoes have been optimized for carrying heavy loads or for being pushed by motors or poles or by sails. And at every turn you make, a concession or a compromise has been made. And I find that's where we can really make some interesting connections. So let's jump into this collection a little bit here. I'll just run through a quick essay to say, within this big group, you can start to take a string of yarn and connect one to another and come to understand communities, sub-communities within this group that are to be found. Japan is ambitiously planning for an Olympics next year, and good luck to them in a COVID environment. I recently did a study on this in an exhibit with a colleague, and worked with athletes and watercraft designers from all over to put this exhibit together. This is a collection found in that back building that is the most comprehensive known to exist on international organized canoe and kayak racing that is seen both at the International Federation, but also at the Olympics. And these are clearly boats that are designed to go fast and to go in a straight line and not much else. Well, where did this international sport get organized? Well, it starts with a simple idea, which was turning up in the backwoods all across Canada, in birch bark, in dugout, and then later, as industry gets involved in making this, Peterborough becomes a really important manufacturing center for canoes used. But canoes used for racing initially began as just canoes that were used for other parts of our lives. When the British and the Americans get involved with this sport, it seems like their interests really focused more around canoes that we would describe more as kayaks today. They were shallow, decked over, paddled with a double blade like you would a kayak today. And in the international sport, the Canadians keep turning up with these open canoes that the internationals come to call the Canadian canoe. And in Germany, this would be called a Kanadische canoe. Fun little story that turns up at an international meet in the late 19th century. They were having races, and most of the canoes were decked over double blade watercraft, and a Canadian hunting and fishing guide from Rice Lake named Wallace shows up with a canoe like this, and he says, well, I'd like to compete. And they said, well, sorry, chap, we've only got the double blades to race you against. Hope you're okay with that. And he said, yeah, that's fine. And to their dismay, not only did he win paddling it with a single blade, but he also did so allegedly smoking his pipe the whole time. And that just sort of reflects the lifestyle that comes with living hunting and fishing, and spending all your life in a canoe can certainly bear you well. There was a lot of resistance to the to professionals turning up at these events, and I think a hunting and fishing guide might have been considered an event, professional. Well, eventually they had to standardize what people were showing up with, and they arrive at this design called a peanut, pointed at both ends, of course. They settle in eventually at 17 feet in length, or 5.2 meters long. And I see Tammy McDonald has entered the waiting room. Are you going to get that? Shall I admit her? I can do. Oh, you've got it. But this is a simple hull that was designed for the racing so that you could paddle it with a single blade, like what we'd call a canoe paddle, or with a kayak paddle, a double blade, and it could be paddled by one or two. And at the Olympics today, if you're interested in this, this would be considered a C1 or a C2, which is a canoe 1 or canoe 2 paddler, and a K1 and a K2, a kayak 1 and a kayak 2. And it was just to standardize it. Well, the Second World War comes and goes as it did, and it injects everything with new technology. And one of the innovations that it brought that was really perfected making twin-engined night fighters and bombers, called the Mosquito, the de Havilland Mosquito for the RAF, was brought into canoes. And this is laminated mahogany veneer. It makes a very stiff, watertight hull, extremely lightweight. The canoe looks just the same. It meets all the classes, and the class design says your canoes have to be 5.2 meters long, no longer, no shorter. And it has to be 52 centimeters wide, 30 inches wide. No concave surfaces, and other than that, off you go. And so this is what an Olympic canoe from the 50s in our collection looks like. Oh, I'm so sorry. By the 1970s, you get some real brilliance coming into the design who are chafing against those limitations. And a Danish designer named Jorgen Samson says, well, nowhere does it say the widest part of the canoe needs to be in the middle. That's just what canoes have always looked like. What if we push it behind the paddler? Now, if you are a canoeist and you've paddled a canoe, you know that if you're paddling, certainly if you're paddling solo, every stroke you take pushes you off course a little bit. It pushes you away from the side you're paddling on. And so a canoeist eventually needs to learn how to do what's called the J stroke. And that's you do a stroke and you roll it, and you actually do a bit of a ruddering, and you pry that paddle away from the canoe, and it swings the bow back on course. Or you keep flipping sides and you zigzag your way down the end of the course. Well, the reason for that is you're paddling so far from the middle of the canoe. It's like having a motor strapped to the side of your boat and not in the middle along the center line. And it kind of eventually pushes you off course. And so this designer says, well, if we move the widest part behind the paddler, that means that paddle stroke is a little closer to the midline of the canoe. And at the end of 500 meters, you may have done 2 or 3 less corrective strokes to hold your course. Well, that means a great deal. That might mean you win by half a canoe length when you cross the finish line. So this designer didn't change the rules and wasn't disqualified. And it was a success because next year, all of the canoes look like this. This was called the Delta design. So it's some serious brilliance working in a framework of rules, until the Polish designers with Plastex get involved, and they said, well, nowhere does it say it can't look like this. Integral to the hull, if you take this boat and you took it like silly putty and you stretch off of it 2 horns at the widest point, and you make those 52 centimeters apart somewhere way up in the air, if you draw those down to an angle, the part of the canoe that's actually underwater is now narrower by centimeters, which means the hull that's underwater where the friction is happening is much narrower. If you can stay upright, well, you're definitely crossed the finish line first. Well, the judges get onto this and they say, but hang on, hang on. The widest part of this canoe cannot also be the tallest. That's also in the rules. And the designers said, well, you notice that horn on the front, that's not just where you attach your race number. That's actually, I think, a ½ centimeter taller than these horns. And so this canoe had to be allowed and not disqualified. And next year, all of the designs looked like this until 2000 at Sydney Olympics, where the rules, the federation said, look, if you get rid of these horns, they're ridiculous, by the way, but we get it. The designers have beat class ruling. If you can stay upright and you keep your hull lengths appropriate, your widths don't matter. And here is an incredible Canadian athlete named Laurence Vincent Lapointe out of Trois-Rivières in Quebec. She's been an amazing ambassador, as have a lot of women championing in the sport. And one of the reasons why their voice is so important is the Olympics, for I think about 85 years, has not allowed women's events in open canoe.
Jeremy, I wonder if, could you share your screen again? Did you have a slide for that?
Oh, what? Am I not sharing my screen?
Oh, it just happened just recently. And and I wonder if you could just go back one more just to show us, because you were talking about this horn and I just wanted to see it.
Okay, so here, I'm so sorry. Thank you for interrupting. Can you see that? Can you see that now?
Yes, now I can see it.
So this wooden canoe here, this was the Danish designer who moved the widest part behind the paddler.
Nice, okay.
And then here's the Polish design where they put on these two horns.
Wonderful.
That are wider than the rest of the hull that's below the surface, of course, but not quite as tall as that horn that's on the forward deck. So that's the Polish design that sort of, where the designers defeat one of the ruling classes and in the regulations. And so now essentially the canoes, if you can see Laurence paddling her C1,
wow,
she is paddling a canoe that is now narrower than kayaks are at the Olympic event, because the kayaks still have to hold the paddler's hips, whereas the canoe only has to hold your knee and 2 feet. And so she is an upside down triangle of horsepower with an incredible sense of balance, and burning along on the race course. There are many, many terrific champions out of Canada who have been an ambassador for the sport internationally, because the Olympics has not allowed for women in this sport. It was some years ago that the International Federation said it has to do with reproductive organs, which is garbage. It just meant what really needs to happen is they had to eliminate a few other events in order to allow for this. And Tokyo should have finally, after 8 decades, included some open canoe events for women, which would have been terrific. But I suppose chauvinism is still in place. I don't know if you've caught recent comments out of Japan. I think, was it yesterday or the day before, talking about women being at meetings,
yeah,
causing them. So now we have a lot of work to be done there, but I'm just so proud of the Canadian athletes who've been international ambassadors. And the canoe that I just showed you in the preceding slide, right here with the horns, this belonged to a Canadian champion named Sheila Kuiper, who in the 1990s founded an organization called Women Can, and which was an advocacy group to change the rulings at the international level to allow for sports at the Olympics for women in open canoe and also in flat water and also whitewater. It's now become an international organization. And when Sheila donated this canoe to the museum, she signed it with her name, but also the name of her organization, Women Can. It's written inside. It's a beautiful piece of work. So that's just a little run through of one wonderful, wacky little collection within a room like this. And we're not into the exhibits at the museum yet. And I do urge you, if you have not visited us yet, please do come and see the exhibits. They're stunning. And they'll be here for another year or two yet before we hope to move. But that's a lot of canoes from here, from around the world. What are the older ones? What's the oldest known canoe? And where you might expect to find some of the oldest canoes, and I've pulled up a slide, if you can tell me you see that, Tina. These are some dugout canoes that have been recovered at the bottoms of lakes and rivers from around Canada. A lot of these come from Ontario. And most of the canoes in the museum's collection that came out of the bottoms of lakes and rivers, a lot of these turned up by cottagers when they're putting in a new dock. They think that looks like a log, but it turns out it's pointed at both ends and hollowed out. These show evidence of more historic period markings, such as strips of metal used to be there with the little metal nails that straddled a crack. You know, we're in the historical era when metal fastenings were used, or maybe an auger and a bracelet and bit were used to drill holes or that. So these are not particularly old. We have 7 in the collection. One from Algonquin Park, if you're curious, one from Kinmount. But there's a lake, for instance, in Florida where over 100 of these have been located at the bottom of Noonan's Lake. And these date from 2,300 to 5,000 years old. They've all been surveyed, some carbon dating, carbon analysis, radioactive carbon analysis done there. Pretty exciting discoveries, just showing the antiquity of these canoe routes that have been in use for millennia, of course, no surprise. And I would say in the bottom right, the oldest object that I know of in our collection is a canoe making tool. And this is a canoe, a gouge. It would have been used sort of like a chisel before it was damaged centuries ago, thousands of years ago, perhaps. And this would have been made downstream of Rice Lake at Healy's Falls at a groundstone quarry site and used for chipping away a log, hollowing it out, either for a cooking dish, perhaps, or for making canoes. And so that would be, from our collection, I would wager the oldest object. The oldest known canoe in our collection actually turned up not recently in Canada, but actually in Europe, in Cornwall. And this is a birch bark canoe. So the family history goes that was acquired during the American Revolution during the 1770s. And the revolutionaries had pushed north and laid siege to Montreal and Quebec. While Montreal capitulated, Quebec remained under siege and by the revolutionaries. And this large troop ship comes in from England with soldiers and horses and carriage pieces and does some reconnaissance and then puts its soldiers on shore and chases the revolutionaries south. And a few years later, when the war wraps up, this canoe somehow made its way back to Europe and ended up in the barn of a lieutenant colonel who served in the campaign. And there it remained for 250 years in this storage shed. It's not perhaps had an easy life. You can see it's laying in the floor of this shed next to an old toilet bathroom renovation. There's some seafoam green toilets and sinks in the backyard. And the canoe was broken into 2 pieces, sad to say. The canoe needs a lot of love. And important work lies ahead to reconnect that canoe with the community it came from. And a lot of work yet to be done. We hope to be embarking on that in the coming 2 years as we're doing exhibits research for our new museum. To reconnect the canoe to its community if we're able to, and that's archival research across the pond with the regiment and locally as well. But here it's being welcomed back into Mississauga territory where it rests at the Canadian Canoe Museum. We are generously joined by Unity drummers to welcome the canoe home. Doug Williams was there to speak and oversee the reception. We're also joined by Stephen Augustine, hereditary chief with Mi'kmaq, Wyoming, and Cape Breton, who also spoke from an East Coast perspective. This canoe was certainly, it was acquired on the St. Lawrence River. We just don't know how far east along. It was probably east of Quebec City, but as I said, a lot of work yet to be done. And to advise on what care it will receive as well. So where does a collection like this come from? How does it gather? Well, it certainly gathered by passion. And this passion traces back to one individual. I apologize for the quality of the photo on the left. Professor Kirk Whipper was running a summer camp when he wasn't teaching at U of T. And it was a camp that offered a lot of canoeing program. And he was offered one day in the 1950s a historic dugout canoe that was made up in the Lakefield, or in the Warsaw area, not far from where I live. And that's it featured in the lower right. This is a basswood log canoe, probably made in the late 1800s by the Payne brothers. It's a common name out in Warsaw way. And Whipper hung this in the dining hall as a talking point to talk about heritage and culture associated with the act of canoeing. And as these things go, you only have to look at the McMichael's remarkable collection and contribution that into what becomes the McMichael Gallery. This one canoe attracted 2 more, attracted 5 more, and eventually the dining hall rafters were full of canoes, and he starts using other outbuildings. And the act of gathering canoes becomes a consuming passion for Professor Whipper and frankly anybody in his orbit. Anybody with a car, anybody with resources or muscle or energy to lend. In that photograph, Kirk has his hands resting on a very precious canoe to him and to that museum, and certainly to the Canadian Canoe Museum today. And I'm going to come back to that one, but it was a Haida canoe commissioned by that museum, the Kanawha Museum. And it became the first canoe entered into what was a new museum called the Kanawha Museum, as I said, now acting as a museum does, where in ways that it thinks and cares for and tracks and manages a collection. So in the records of the Canadian Canoe Museum that it inherited from this organization, this is the first entry. And so I sort of see this as the seed that really grows a collection, a really meaningful collection that has national outreach and engagement. That was commissioned in 1968 and completed in 1971. And I will come back to that particular canoe. The collection that was assembled is quite large. Before we acquired it, it was over 500. We now are well over 600 canoes and kayaks from across Canada, across Turtle Island. About 3/4 of them are of non-Indigenous manufacture, and about 1/4 of them are of Indigenous make and use. 20% of them from across Turtle Island, across Canada, and about 5% of them from Indigenous communities around the world. So it gives you sort of a sense of the shakedown of a collection like this, remembering that while the emphasis in how we think about this and represent canoeing and kayaking in Canada today has a very strong Canadian emphasis, it certainly has a lot to share and a lot to learn from Indigenous communities around the world. Not just canoes, and we've heard since the very beginnings of the Canadian Canoe Museum, when that remarkable collection from the woods at the summer camp in Northern Ontario came down to Peterborough through vision of a number of Peterborough locals, many of whom Trent faculty, and this organization owes a lot to Trent for its beginnings here. Professor Tom Simons always commented that a museum without an archives is like a tree without roots, and collecting canoes and keeping and caring for canoes deserves a research and knowledge center to support the activities. And this is a real growing area for this museum. Right now, our archival collection is stored under the grand staircase as you come in, and it's located next to the pump room of our water feature, which is a high risk and non-accessible area. It's a real limitation of one of many of our current locations. And we hope to be growing a wonderful new archives and reading area in our new museum. Recently acquired an astonishing private collection from a collector in Toronto who had, before his death, acquired a library that he and his family wanted to give to us. And it was a collection dedicated to the canoe in the Canadian North, rare books collection, first encounters, fur trade writers, a lot of Northwest Passage writers with early exchanges, interchanges between Indigenous and settler populations, a lot of colonial history wrapped up there, of course, a lot of more recent recreational discovery of canoeing and so on. And this collection that we acquired turned out to be 14,000 titles. And that's it there when we just acquired it from one house after that collector's passing, and his family offered it to the Canadian Canoe Museum. So we boxed those books up book by book with volunteer support, and here they are, and we're slowly going through the collection, purging from it what we don't want to keep or the duplications, and keeping what we are keeping for our own growing, as you can imagine, resource library. We've also been collecting manufacturing records and photographs and other written records, including recently the most comprehensive records of canoe manufacturing here in Peterborough. And that's another important reason why the museum has good reason to be in Peterborough. It was known internationally as a manufacturing epicenter for canoes and watercraft. More patented methods of wrapping wood around compound curves to make lightweight canoes were developed here than anywhere else. Canoes were exported internationally. The name Peterborough becomes sort of synonymous with the canoe. And this was another private collector's passion gifted to the Canoe Museum with a few champions helping along the way. And this is another really important archival collection to help us understand as we this and share it with others. Not just books and boats. This wind chime in the bottom right is a collection of paddles, 540 canoe paddles from across Canada, indeed around the world, some of which are associated with canoes and kayaks on exhibit, many with canoes and kayaks that are in storage, and others that just paddles with stories to tell. Upper left are tools specific to making canoes. Lots of great camping gear, expedition equipment, taking us back a century and a half. All the stuff that sort of helps us round out the story. And then a couple of individuals with great stories to tell. Farley Mowat, if you've ever read any of his writing, certainly our most published author in Canada. Well, this was a canoe when he offered it to us. He said, well, this was the canoe I was conceived in. Now, Farley was never one to let facts get in the way of a good story, and that was the one he opened with. He had many other, perhaps a lot more powerful stories to go with it. But if you've heard Gord Lightfoot's song, "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," you'll also know, or you'll appreciate that he has another shipwreck that figured prominently in his life. We were looking for a canoe made of this material that this yellow canoe is made from. This is a wonder material from the 1970s called Royal X, sometimes called ABS. And the gift of this, apart from the fact it's incredibly heavy, is that if it does end up filling with water and moving water and hits a rock and ends up wrapped in half, or if it falls out of a truck or is indeed thrown off the roof of a multi-story building and it bends in half, it'll spring back into shape. And Gord Lightfoot was in 1980 on the Nahanni River paddling his beloved canary yellow canoe with a friend of the museum's named Fred Gaskin. And they were lining the canoe down a set of rapids, and the canoe gets away from them and it fills with water and wraps around the rock. And here you can see in the lower image, it pinned around a boulder in a set of rapids. Now, we were looking for a Royal X canoe that had been, it has to have been wrapped, and it has to tell a hell of a good story to represent all of the other Royal X canoes that are in garages out there that will eventually be offered to us because they get heavier as we get older. And they carry the wonderful scars of their journey. And so in this one fell swoop, not only did we get this great story, but Lightfoot wrote a song about it called My Canary Yellow Canoe. And so that is a wonderful new addition and a personality in the collection. Canoes are not, in the museum's collection, are not just about caring for and stewarding canoes that were once used, but it's also to inspire the making and the ongoing traditions. And in the left-hand image is a beloved couple recognized by the Canadian Canoe Museum, one of two of our first canoe builders emeritus, William and Mary Commanda from Gitigan-Zibi in Quebec near Maniwaki. There are 5 canoes in the museum's collection made by this legendary couple. In his latter years, William Commanda became known internationally as an elder and at the center of a movement that drew together people from different cultural backgrounds to bridge common understanding and environmental response and respect. Well, Chuck and Mary's grandson, William and Mary's grandson, Chuck Commanda, has of course become a canoe builder of note in his own right. And a few years ago, we were honored to feature Chuck as a canoe maker here in his AC/DC t-shirt, building a canoe called a Jiman, a Wigwasa Jiman, here at the Canadian Canoe Museum. And he had a lot of help from students under him along the way, and some youth also joined him from local communities to work on this canoe. And I'll never forget when Chuck unrolled the birch bark, Chuck and Stephen Hunter helping him unrolled the birch bark for the media opening of this project. Cameras were there filming Chuck. He'd been soaking it for a few days in a creek. They were soaking them in the water And as he unrolled the birch bark to get underway with staking it out for the building, a couple of crayfish skittered out from the rolls of birch bark in front of the cameras. And so when the canoe was finished, Elder Doug Williams helped out with the name translated into Michisagig Nishnabemowin. So this canoe that is now in the museum's collection is called Shagishe. If I have that pronunciation right, apologies, Doug, I should know better. And there's Crayfish Canoe down at the lift lock, ready for its launching a couple of years ago. It's a great ongoing story, many more canoes to be built. The canoe, of course, also brings out some madness in us. And here's a story with no shortage of that. Don Starkel from Winnipeg paddled 20,000 kilometers from Winnipeg to Brazil with one of his sons, wrote a book, a compelling book about it called Paddle to the Amazon. Lots of adventure, lots of hardship along the way, misadventure, hung up on reefs, the canoe broken multiple times. But reflecting back, Don saw that his greatest challenge on the journey came not from the environment that he paddled as he worked his way down the Mississippi from Winnipeg and through Central America or across the top coast of South America, but in fact from humankind. And left a great story for it. A lot of people have come looking for this canoe to see the scars and of course the great collage of bumper stickers Oriana picked up along the way. When I started, I was talking about watersheds, and no other object perhaps can articulate this better than the old chestnut story from 1940s, written by Holling Clancy Holling, Paddle to the Sea. Canadian filmmaker Bill Mason. Oh, wow. At the end of the day, Bill Mason did a wonderful NFB about this. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. It's a bit dated, but it's a really compelling story that takes us through the watersheds of the Great Lakes. And this is a stunt double, I should say. It's not the original. It was a resin cast, one of the several that Mason used when he was filming his NFB documentary. And here he is, Bill, working with 1970s technology, home-built cameras to be filmed while wading in the water. And in moving water and whitewater. Bill also is instrumental in inspiring countless people to get out and discover the natural environment in their backyard and the places further afield. Some pursue wilderness. Some recognize as they're discovering wilderness that the wilderness they discover also happens to be somebody's home. The farther north you get, you're not entering an empty landscape by any stretch. But Bill is a big part of the story in understanding recent canoeing activity in North America. Another name, Robert Bateman, as an environmentalist and a painter. I love this canoe also not because it was a muse for Bateman, but because of its maker. And May Minto made this canoe for him. She was a riveter during the Second World War, making Lancaster bombers. And then through the family business, got into wood canvas canoe making. In the 1970s, Bateman commissioned a little 13-foot canoe for Bateman to get out and do sketching. Bateman painted this canoe lovingly painted green. And when I went out to film Bateman paddling it one last time before he gifted it to the Canoe Museum, he had turned the canoe upside down and had mixed up his artist paints and was filling in scratches and gouges and nicks in the canvas because the grandkids had been up on the weekend to paddle it one last time and before saying goodbye to it. And he couldn't let it come to a museum collection like ours without giving it a proper coat of paint. So you can actually see on the canoe in this lower image some darker wet paint patches, but he was kind enough to get out and I filmed him. I will say, if any of you are risk management students, I did insist that he take my PFD out paddling, even though he's only in 4 feet of water in this pond, but he refused to wear it. He insisted on kneeling in it, so you can't see the PFD. But forget not that the canoe retains its enduring connections to the Indigenous communities that invented it and continue to hold deep meaning with the canoe, and the canoe carries the deep meanings of the communities it comes from. And the museums everywhere are on an existential journey, those that care for canoes from Indigenous communities. Canoe Museum is no exception. And we've been fortunate over the years to have some rich relations across the country, but a great deal of work to be done. to really breathe life into those relationships. And if I can maybe articulate what our hopes are for that to be reflected through the museum, if we do our job, we would love the Canoe Museum to be seen as a platform through which these communities share their stories. Their stories are kept with their communities and shared through the Canoe Museum to a wider audience. These may not be easy stories always to be heard, but they're important to hear. And they're certainly an important, those interactions are so important for us, certainly guided by the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Report 2015. But this process is for us also governed by OCAP, ownership, control, access, and permissions in the research that we're doing. And so the journey that we're on now is we're building a new museum is to create exhibits within the museum that reflect parity within the exhibits of Indigenous and non-Indigenous experience. And that's reflected in the watercraft on display, but that's also reflected in the people that you meet and the voices you hear and the language that you hear and read. So for this new facility, the wayfinding, the signs that direct you to the washrooms or the cafe or the elevator will be in Michisagic, Anishinaabemowin, also French and English. And in the exhibits, when you encounter a kayak from the Arctic, from Baffin Island or from Labrador, the voice and perspectives, as much as possible through the support and engagement with those communities, will be reflective of not only their voice and perspectives, but the dialects from those communities. And not, in the Arctic, for instance, it's an interesting challenge because Central Arctic Inuktitut is such a strong force, but there are so many dialects, and not only are Indigenous languages challenged and in many cases endangered, and COVID poses such a threat to elders in many communities. Of course, in some communities where not many elders are the only ones who are born speakers that remain. But then within if you look at the Canadian Arctic, there are other dialects that themselves are on a journey just to preserve and to foster the continuation of their specific dialect. And so as much as possible, the museum is hoping and creating space for to celebrate their challenges and their efforts to retain and sustain those language dialects. And that's a real diversity. It's a large amount of work, and we respect the fact that that work will be an ongoing process in the exhibit's development. And so in our strategy, there will be the opportunity to enhance the exhibits after their opening, to onboard the ongoing work that is being cultivated. So how are we going to do that? Well, we start locally, working with Michisagi communities here in Treaty 20 territories, larger Williams Treaties First Nations with the Chippewas nations to the west of us, and then out and beyond. The Canoe Museum has many relationships that are ongoing, and relationships specifically related to canoes or kayaks in particular. And I'll reflect that just last week, to support this work, I should mention Dr. Laura Peers has joined our team to manage the exhibits, the collaborative relations work for the exhibits development for this museum. It's been a terrific new relationship and addition to our team. And we're hoping to onboard community liaison, community engagement liaison people, consultants essentially, to work safely within their communities, because we're not visiting them, nor do they want us to go there, to work within their communities to bring the stories that they would like shared through the Canoe Museum. So the curatorship is happening in those communities and will be brought into the exhibit development process here in Peterborough. But those stories will remain with them. And so last week, while we were meeting with a young kayak maker and kayaker, he's a kayak lead specialist in Labrador. His name is Noah Nokasak. Now, Noah is an incredible young man who has paddled over 6,000 kilometers in kayak himself, in kayaks himself, 300 miles in a skin-on-frame kayak up the coastline of Labrador. And you just have to look at maps of it to imagine what that is like, kayaking in 20-foot swells. Polar bears are there. And there are two kayaks from communities nearby, one from where his grandfather comes from. And so on a Zoom meeting last week, we were there all from our respective spaces, and I was in the exhibits where where the kayaks are on display, and I had the laptop over my head showing construction details, and he was leaning in, looking at the way that the deck beams are attached to the gunnels, excited to build replicas of this kayak and get out on the water and try them out. He says, everybody paddles Greenland kayaks. I want to get out and put this onto sea trials. And so a lot of work to be done. Remember that dugout canoe that I mentioned earlier that was commissioned from Haida Gwaii? Well, last year I visited Masset and Skidegate and Haida Gwaii with an armload of photographs and records from our museum to meet with the cultural institutions there and the Haida Nation Council, but also the family members of the community. And we recently came into a wonderful collection of slides when the canoe was launched with the family. In the upper right, you can see the canoe being paddled by the folks from Ontario who came out to collect it. And I should mention their first attempt to paddle it was a bit tippy. And when they reflected on it to the carver, he said, well, you'll find it paddles better when you face the other direction. You're paddling it backwards, you dummies. And so that story has been retained in the family for 50 years, as it has within the museum. But the photographs we recently acquired from somebody who was also there were recently digitized by an intern and here at the Canoe Museum, Mary Jane Prue, and she has joined our exhibits development team, and we've been sharing these back with the community members and with the family members, and they're thrilled to see these images from that day. Don't forget, this is a canoe that was made there, but it left, and so to a large effect, it's been forgotten. And so for it to come back to them in memory, they're so glad it's here at the Canoe Museum as an opportunity to speak to the public, and through that canoe to the wider audience. Here's our tired little home. If you haven't visited us, it's well, we've been here a quarter century now. It's a 70-year-old factory. We've outgrown its offering, and we'd hope to build a brand new museum by the lift lock. Let me get this out of the way. This was a wonderful new home we'd been working on the last 3 years to build, but it was not to be. Although despite early environmental testing, we discovered late in the game the site was too contaminated. Our building was too far underground, cut into the side of the drumlin. We couldn't manage that. To remediate the property next door would have taken too long. And so we had to walk away from that, which was very hard. It's been not an easy journey for us, as you can imagine, in a global pandemic, no less. But we pivoted very quickly, and we spent the last summer and fall to find a new site. And if you've been following us in any way, you'll know that we've found a new site, and we've recently announced through a partnership with the city, approved to purchase this site called the Johnson site, between Trent Severn headquarters and Beavermead Park on the east side of Little Lake. It is a stunningly beautiful home for the Canadian Canoe Museum. There's the Trans-Canada Trail running in along the shoreline. There's a tree canopy behind it you're going to see in a second. And beyond that is a flat level. All of this foreground is floodplain. It's a very sensitive site. We have no interest in disturbing the site-sensitive environmental setbacks of it, or the creek mouth to the right, to the south of this property, or the floodplain nature of this, nor the Trans-Canada Trail. And so looking at it from above, you can see where we're positioning our new home. In order to make it fit, we're making a 2-story construction. This is just a footprint. It's not even going to look like that, I can guarantee you. But I just wanted to show some of the adjacencies of this wonderful new home. This is giving us such promise and such wind in our sails. It's a stunning place for a new watercraft collection like this, and as a community hub, and frankly, as an economic driver for this museum, for this community. We have assembled an incredible team to build this museum, and the architects are a local firm. They've done terrific work. We're building an organization that puts program functionality and finds its elegance through simplicity first and foremost. Right up front, we've assembled a team through a very innovative procurement method called integrated project delivery. So all of our major construction partners are there as stakeholders right from the get-go. And we are able to come up with concept renderings by early summer, and we'll be sharing those publicly. But it also means that we'll know exactly how much money this project is going to cost, and that'll allow us to get started construction this coming fall. It's absolutely critical. We have to. We have some funding milestones we need to meet. We need to start construction this fall. And we're going to bring you a new home that's going to open to the public in 2024. And I can't wait to open the doors for you. There'll be so much new to experience. This will be an inspiring new home that's been built by many hands and many voices and perspectives from across the country reflected through this organization. So much more than this little grassroots organizing. So that's the end of my slide deck. I'd love to open it up if there are any questions that have come in along the way. Please feel free.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was amazing. Oh, I learned so much from you just now. I hope that students take the chance to watch this video after, because it was so informative, even more so than my visit to the Canoe Museum. It was wonderful.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So I do see a question by Edie Steele, wondering about, so the location, I also was looking at the map to see, is it across from those soccer fields? Is that the idea? Like that kind of just before the new development area? I could see that the roads there.
Yeah, you got it. I didn't want to dwell too much on the details here, but let's get into it just quickly. So yes, because this is so much floodplain and we've positioned the building so close to Ashburnham to keep away from the sensitive areas, there's limited parking on that property. And so right across the street is city-owned Eastgate Memorial Park parking. To the north is that big soccer pitch. If you've ever been here in the summer and you know the soccer tournaments there's cars parked all over the grass and the curbs and sidewalks and everywhere else along that way. And to the south of us, just below this creek mouth, is the chip truck. Underneath the A in Beavermead is the red chip truck.
Yeah.
And then of course, Beavermead parking lot.
Well, that's honestly, I didn't know. I remember being so upset for you when I learned about what happened near the lift locks, and what a great alternative. I cannot believe you found such another fantastic location like that. Anyway, so wonderful. Looks like you're going to be able to just get onto a canoe right from the park and get out and explore.
Isn't that terrific?
Okay, so I have a question for you. So, you know, you've talked about how, you know, really the fundamental purpose of canoes, that we're using them now. I mean, less for sometimes for the actual like working workhorse, but more for enjoyment and getting out to the environment.
Yep.
And that's what our college, one of our biggest themes is just get out and play. That's one of the things that I really hope that the college theme just remains, and that's what we focus on here. So we do get students into canoes on the autonomy here as well for fall college weekend as much as we can. But can you share with me, and this might be a hard question because I did hear that you did your honeymoon was a canoe trip, but so can you share with me what your favorite canoe trip was? And maybe I'm not sure if it includes the honeymoon or not. That's why it might be a hard question, but
you're really priming me to tell that story, are you? Okay, well, I will. I'll tell that story. And sadly, that canoe is no longer in our hands, but that's another good story. Yeah, so I guess when in my 10, 15-year-old bio that you embarrassed me by at the beginning of this, and I made a note, I got to go in and clean that up. Some years ago, I made a birch bark canoe. Well, it would be 24 years ago because I've been married 23. And for our honeymoon, my wonderful wife and partner, Anna, and I decided we did a number of canoe trips, including 2 weeks in Algonquin Park, or just under 2 weeks. And so we had incredible weather in October, and this brand new birch bark canoe that I'd brought a little repair kit to go with it, which included a tuna fish can full of melted spruce gum pitch and spruce roots and everything you need to keep a canoe underway. Didn't think we'd use it much. And on one long grueling portage, I remember putting the canoe down and hearing a little pop sound. And at one end, didn't think much about it. We got to the end of the portage and put the canoe in the water, and we loaded it up. And the canoe quickly filled with water right up to the gunnels, and the pack started floating. And here's the thing: a birch bark canoe, unlike that canary yellow canoe I told you about, is not infinitely indestructible. But the genius of this, and this is truly one of the extraordinary technological geniuses, I would say, to really call out of human technology anywhere in the world, is the birch bark canoe. Certainly not the one I made. It was pretty crude, but you just have to look through a collection that is reflected here in the museum's collection and just see that each one is a work of art for different reasons. But there is sort of a weak spot in them, an Achilles heel, and that is about, I don't know, half a meter, a foot or so in from the ends. And it's where the framing, there's a change in framework beneath the birch bark. At the very cutwater ends of the canoe is this stem piece. And then you have thin layers of planking that are up against the birch bark. And then you have your first rib, which starts about a foot back. And between the stem piece and that first rib, there isn't quite the same amount of support. And that is exactly where I dropped the canoe down. I was exhausted. I can even remember it. And somebody had been brushing the portage and left a thumb thick sapling sticking up out of the ground. It was probably like a striped maple. And it hits the canoe in this one weak spot. And given the tension that the birch bark is under, which is part of that genius, it becomes sort of stronger than the sum of its parts by the whole thing being spring loaded. The birch bark snapped from gunnel to gunnel. It just cracked right around and opened up the throat of the canoe at the end. And that's where the water was coming in, was by about this half-inch spread, centimeter wide split in the birch bark. So there we were a few days in. And actually, the really cool takeaway from this takeaways were, one is to repair the canoe. It took us about 6 hours because I had to, maybe there's these, what is that term, in legal term, when enough time has gone by. I had to wander way off the portage, skin a piece of birch bark to sew into place, take all the planks and ribs out and stitched it in place, put the canoe back together, dried it out and gummed it. So it worked again. And in fact, it was bone dry for, I think, another 12 days. But the genius of it really is that you trade off, you don't have anything that is indestructible, but you have something that is infinitely repairable in the bush. And that is from my perspective, from just a technology perspective, that is a much better insurance plan. Because if you have a bit of knowledge and you have the materials at hand, you will always need that to get out. And when I thought about it, 2 days of canoeing, how much would that have been walking out? This was October, and it was cold water. It's Algonquin Park. You want to minimize your crossings. It would have been days and days and days to get back to the car without that canoe. And so we had to fix it. And so a lot of lessons learned on that. One of which was that Anna was incredibly patient with me on this ridiculous caper. And we're happily still married, I'm happy to say. And she's still up for good capers like that. And she certainly puts me through some too. So there's my story. How was that?
That was absolutely fantastic. I could talk to you all day, Jeremy, because you seem like you're an excellent speaker. I really hope that I can get you back to the college next year as well, because students need to know this. Edie put a comment in again, and then I love this comment because I also experienced the same thing. So they've had visited the Canoe Museum numerous times with international visitors and have always found it extremely interesting, looking forward to the new location. So I also have brought students to the Canoe Museum. In particular, it was with Deborah Barrell. She really thought that our WUSC students, so we have a student refugee program here at Trent. And so we had, at this time, I think about 10 newcomers, or maybe it was 8 that came with us that day, took them ice fishing, and then ended the day at the Canoe Museum. Cool. And that was a lot of patience, I'd like to say, on behalf of that student group, but they really were touched by the Canoe Museum. It was a great place because every culture has boats. Like, that's the beauty about the Canoe Museum. And even I remember when I was there, I went to Lake Titicaca before, and I saw that you have the picture of the big yellow boats, and I got to see those in person. And really there is boats whether they're canoeists or not, are such a connection to people's culture.
Yep.
And it was really meaningful for them to be in the Canoe Museum. So I hope that any international students watching this, we will make sure that we will be engaging and trying to get students to the Canoe Museum
I hope you
in
do.
the future years.
It's great to hear. That's really great to hear. We've actually had a few citizenship ceremonies held at the Canoe Museum too, which was really moving for us as the hosts to have such an important milestone in people's lives hosted here. But it's a great place to sort of dip a toe into the crazy mythology of Canada, but also to encounter as I've talked about earlier, the enduring relations that Indigenous communities right across the country still have, and presence they do have here in Canada, right there in front of you. What we could always do a better job of, I think, is celebrating the other Indigenous canoeing traditions around the world. And our collection is not enormous to reflect that, but it would certainly we've done a few exhibits in the past. You talk about the Totora Reed canoes from Lake Titicaca, Peru, Bolivia, but there are a number of other wonderful, wonderful canoes from elsewhere around the world, and we should be celebrating that as well.
Well, thank you again so much for this amazing conversation, and I look forward to meeting with you again sometime soon, Jeremy.
It's great to be here. And,
Okay, cheers.
okay.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye now.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Anna. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.